Hey, I'm Daniel and welcome back to another Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era video. And today we're talking about the Necromancer class, unveiling its dark arts, summoning skills and unique mechanics. As always in my class guide videos, I'll be covering everything you need to know about this class, how their abilities work, how and when to upgrade to the master side, which races pair well with them, what starting skill line to choose, what additional skill lines offer good synergy and what items can enhance the build. And finally, I'll show a bit of gameplay so you could get a sense of how the class actually plays and feels at the table. I'll put timestamps in the description if you want to jump ahead, although I would really appreciate if you stick around for the whole thing. Now, a quick disclaimer, I think figuring things out for yourself is one of the most rewarding parts in this game, and I would encourage everyone to experiment and find their own playstyle. That said, the game can feel a bit overwhelming at first, so this guide is here to help you get started and understand how the class works. And if you're already a seasoned player, I hope you can still find something interesting here too. And now let's get into the guide. Alright, as always, let's start with the innate ability on the Novice side, which says the following. If at least one enemy took damage during your engage, place one health chip here with the maximum of 6. This is your necrosis stack. So unlike most other classes, Necromancer has another resource called this necrosis stack, and it's essentially a resource that is needed to activate your class ability on top of the tenacity cost. And so in order to gain this necrosis stack, enemies need to take damage during your engage. And if you know, the terminology in this game is really important, because taking damage is not the same as dealing damage. For example, let's say you roll this force shock die targeting this skeleton. Because this side of force shock die deals 2 damage, it means that your adventurer deals 2 damage, but because this enemy also has 2 defense, this enemy would take no damage and therefore you would not gain a necrosis stack. The same is true if you would roll this side of the destructive touch, which can instantly defeat an enemy, so with this particular sign the enemy would be just instantly defeated, but you would still not gain the necrosis stack because defeating enemy is not considering as dealing damage, and therefore this enemy is not taking damage and therefore you're not gaining a necrosis stack. I think this is pretty simple but still pretty important, that you actually need to deal some damage that would be enough to go through enemy's defense and all abilities that can prevent some damage like dodge or things like that. So let's say if you would roll force shock with this particular side, which deals 4 damage, that would be enough to go through the enemy defense, and therefore you would take necrosis stack, which would be placed in your class sheet just like that. So this necrosis stack, those health chips that you put on top of your class sheet, they don't do anything on its own, but as I said, it's a resource that needed for some of your class abilities. And the first class ability is Boneyard. For 1 tenacity, enduring in magic battle form, for every 2 chips in your necrosis stack, ignore 1 defense on your target. Now, first of all, this ability is enduring, which means you don't even need to spend that tenacity, you just need to have at least 1 tenacity in order to keep this effect active. And also this ability requires magic battle form, which I think gives quite a strong indicator how you would probably want to level up your character. And so let's bring this skeleton back, let's say as a target, and maybe let's say that we now have 4 health chips in our necrosis stack. Because we have 4 health chips, that means we can ignore 2 defense on the target, and that means if we would roll now force shock on this side, this time it would be enough to defeat this enemy, because we're ignoring 2 defense. And of course, if we go even further with this, if we have 6 chips in our necrosis stack, that means we can ignore potentially up to 3 defense. Let's say we have this enemy, so you can essentially almost treat this as if this die would deal 5 damage, because that's how much damage you would normally need to deal in order to go through the enemy defense and in order for this enemy to take 2 damage. And there is something else you need to know that I think maybe isn't that obvious, because remember that this ability says that you ignore defense only on your target. But there are some abilities in the game that deal damage to units that are not necessarily your targets, for example like this elemental rage. Because what this elemental rage does, it essentially allows you to explode a cash chip and deal that much damage to enemies within 2 hexes of this cash chip, distributed as you want. But the point is that those enemies that not necessarily have to be your target. But here's the thing, remember that whenever you make an engage, you can declare a target. Declaring target is optional and you not always need this, but for abilities like Boneyard you definitely want to consider doing that. And so let me just give you another example. Let's say we have those 2 enemies, cash chip, and we have elemental rage with this result of 5 damage. And according to how this skill works, we can distribute this 5 damage to enemies within 2 hexes away from cash chip as we want. And so normally this skill doesn't require having a target at all, and you can potentially deal up to 5 damage to all enemies. Even if there were more enemies around, you can spread this and distribute it as you want. But the important part is that for none of those enemies you would ignore defense with your Boneyard. And so if you want to ignore defense on your target with Boneyard, even with abilities that don't require a target, you still then need to declare a target. Just remember that you can have have only one target per engage. So for example, you can say, you know what, this Lamia will be my target for this engage, and you roll this die, and this damage would ignore this Lamia defense. But for other enemies, even if you choose to spread the damage across multiple enemies, they will not get this ignoring defense effect. And I know this might be a little bit confusing, but the main point is that some abilities they don't require a target, for example like this Elemental Rage. Meanwhile, Boneyard does require to have a target in order for this effect to work, but even for abilities that don't require target like Elemental Rage, you can still declare a target optionally, but only for a single unit. Even if you deal damage to multiple enemies, still only one of them can be your target, and therefore you can ignore defense only on a single unit per engage, even if you deal damage spread it across multiple units. I hope it makes sense. Moving on to the next class ability, Bone Armor. For 2 tenacity, remove 2 chips from your Necrosis stack and place them under your own chip or that of a companion you control, which may exceed health stat. So I think this ability is pretty simple. You just spend in 2 tenacity and you move in 2 health from your Necrosis stack and placing them under your character or a companion that you control. And this is obviously great because this extra health is essentially becoming your shield, your defense. And it's probably even better than a bonus health because those chips you place in under your character, which means that it can help slightly mitigate even true damage. Just remember that all this extra health gets removed at the end of battle. So let's say if our adventurer has 4 health, which means that the 4 is the maximum number of health you can get, and therefore everything that goes above it, so those 2 extra health, they would be removed at the end of battle. However, if you're low on health, you can still treat this ability almost as a healing ability, because let's say if you would have only 2 out of 4 of your health, then you can spend 2 tenacity to activate Bone Armor and move 2 health chips from your Necrosis stack under your character, and since those 4 health is within the health limit of your character, at the end of battle, those health will stay on your character because it's not exceeding the maximum. So personally, I'm a big fan of this ability. I think it's great, it's very flexible that you can put these health chips not only under your character, but also under your companions, and because it's not a bonus health, it's kinda like your proper health, that extra health that goes under your health chip. I think that is pretty helpful. You can use this as a healing sometimes, or you can use this just as extra health sometimes. It's pretty similar to Sorcerer's Dark Exchange, maybe a slightly worse version, depending on how you look at that, but nevertheless, it's very helpful and I love this ability. Moving on, next we have Blast Bones. For 3 tenacity, in Magic Battle form, remove 6 health chips from your Necrosis stack. Then, draw 3 random level 1 enemies from the enemy bag, deploying them onto unoccupied hexes in range. They act as companions controlled by you. Each of these companions is defeated after it takes its turn. And so this is definitely the most expensive of our class abilities, because not only it costs 3 tenacity, it also requires you to have 6 health chips from your Necrosis stack that you need to remove in order to activate this effect. And when you do, you draw 3 random level 1 enemies and you deploy them in range, which is pretty different from some other summoning abilities, because normally you need to place units to your adjacent hexes, but in this case you can deploy enemies in range. And so let's say if our adventurer has 3 magicka, that means that our range is 3 and therefore we can place 3 enemies within 3 hexes away from us. So let's say it's gonna be a level 1 here, another one here, and another one here. And you don't even need to bother placing health chips under those enemies, because after they act, they defeat it anyway. So I think this ability is pretty fun. I quite like it thematically. You can imagine that you resurrecting all those zombies or kind of things like that. They do the job, they do make one engage, and then they vanish. So that is pretty cool thematically, but in terms of power level though, I think this might be a little bit controversial. Most level 1 enemies have only 1 combat, that means on average, statistically speaking, they can deal only 1 damage per engage, which is just not enough to go through most other units' defense. There are some level 1 enemies that have 2 combat, and therefore they potentially, if you get very lucky, they can deal up to 4 damage, but that is a pretty rare case. That being said, I still quite like this ability, especially in Delves, because the majority of enemies in Delves are typically level 1 or 5, and therefore all these level 1 enemies that you resurrect with Blast Bones is simply more effective against those, compared to some level 10 or 20 enemies that you normally encounter in clash battles. Personally, I wish there was a little bit more flexibility in this ability. Perhaps if it would allow you to spend a different amount of health chips, and therefore resurrect a different amount of enemies, that would work more smooth, because sometimes spending all of your 6 health chips from the Necrosis stack is just not worth it in my opinion. So overall, I think this ability is definitely a very fun one, but to be honest, pretty mediocre power level wise. And finally, we have Spiritual Guardian. For 5 tenacity in Magic Battle form, remove any number of chips from your Necrosis stack and place them under level 1 enemy from the defeated stack. Then deploy that enemy to an unoccupied adjacent hex as a companion controlled by you. It maintains its current health between battles. You may only have 1 Spiritual Guardian companion at a time. And so unlike Blast Bones that you're resurrecting all those level 1 enemies, then act and they get defeated, this Spiritual Guardian companion stays with you and it persists between battles. And what's even more unique about this ability is that this Spiritual Guardian maintains its current health between battles. So normally all companions, they deploy with full health, however your Spiritual Guardian Guardian maintains health between battle, which at first may seem like a bad thing, because normally you would want your companion to deploy with full health, right, in case it get damaged through battle, so you would want to deploy it at full health again. But remember that we have bone armor. Let's say we have this enemy in the defeated stack, and let's say that we spend in 5 tenacity in order to activate Spiritual Guardian. Now we can choose any number of chips from our Necrosis stack, so if you want you can use this even with a single health, and then you're resurrecting this essentially as your companion to adjacent hex. But then let's say if you manage to get more health chips in your Necrosis stack, let's say something like that, then you can use your bone armor to kind of beef up and buff up your companion, adding 2 health chips under its stack, then maybe next turn doing this again, another 2 health chips under this one. And unlike all other normal circumstances where all those extra health chips normally removed at the end of battle, because this ability specifically states that it maintains current health between battles, all those extra health would stay on this companion. That means that you can potentially buff it every battle, adding 2 health and 2 health and 2 health with bone armor every time, so it can potentially get just absolutely ridiculous amount of health, something like that. This sometimes does get absolutely hilarious, and just having this huge tall walking health chip pile is a lot of fun. Of course this ability does cost a lot of tenacity, 5 is a lot, but since this enemy persists between battles, so you don't need to spend this tenacity every time, I think it's pretty reasonable. As the only downside of buffing up your companion with a bunch of health just like we have here is that you can't just freely get rid of this companion. Just for example, let's say at first you used your Spiritual Guardian to resurrect this Vanguard Bandit, but because it has only 1 combat and maybe you realized, you know what, maybe this is not the best companion, I would like to instead resurrect some better minion. But unfortunately you can't just freely get rid of this one. So unfortunately unsummoning is not a thing in this game, you can't just freely unsummon this or replace it with other minion, so the only way to get rid of this companion is by simply let it be defeated in battle. And only then you can use a Spiritual Guardian again, potentially on some better enemy next time. Now let's talk how to become a master Necromancer, and their great requirements are the following. You need to have 3 or more chips in your Necrosis stack when you are defeated. Yes, you heard it right, if you want to become the master of the death, you need to get yourself defeated first. First of all, it says that you need to have 3 or more chips in your Necrosis stack, so make sure that you have these before you get yourself killed. You can also look around the gazetteer, because remember that once you are defeated you are placed in the nearest town, so you can select what town is more appropriate to you, that has ideally some inn or a market or trainers that you want. So yeah, you should really plan your death carefully. But of course all those troubles are needed only when you're playing solo, because if you have another adventure, things get much simpler. You can get yourself defeated with any of those dice and then let another adventure finish off the combat, and this way you can fulfill the requirements of your master upgrade without even failing the encounter. But in any case, even if you're playing solo, which is definitely more challenging, I would still suggest you upgrade into the master side as quick as you can, because there are a couple of specific upgrades there that would make your Necromancer much stronger. So now let's see what's changed on the master side, of course starting with the innate ability. If at least one enemy took damage during your engage or the engage of a companion controlled by you, place 1 health chips here with a maximum of 6. This is your Necrosis stack. So previously on the Novice side, this innate ability worked only when an enemy took damage during your engage, but now it also works on your companions. And this honestly makes such a huge difference, because potentially if you have multiple companions, maybe some of them is resurrected as Spiritual Guardian and maybe from a certain skill lines, or maybe even from the Blast Bones ability. From all of these engages, provided that at least one enemy took damage, you gain that much health chips to your Necrosis stack. And yeah, this thing alone is huge, because where previously you would need to make at least 6 engages in order to get the maximum number of chips in your Necrosis stack, now you can get the same maximum of full stack in 3, 2, and sometimes even a single round. Of course, depending on the number of companions controlled by you that you have. So yeah, this is definitely an awesome upgrade. It makes our Necrosis engine runs more smoothly, and it allows us to use our class abilities more freely, and yeah, this is awesome. Moving on, next we have the upgraded version of Boneyard, which stays the same mechanically, with the only difference that it now costs 0 tenacity. And since this ability is enduring for no tenacity, it's essentially always active. It kinda becomes a part of your innate ability, if you will, which means you always ignore defense on your target, of course provided that you have health chips in your Necrosis stack. That's another huge upgrade. Moving on next to Bone Armor. For 1 tenacity, remove 2 chips from your Necrosis stack and place them under a party member chip, which of course may exceed health stat. So not only this ability now costs 1 tenacity fewer, just a single tenacity instead of 2, which is a certainly very welcome upgrade, but it now also works on party members, and not only on our character or companion, which means it can work on other adventurers as well. It's not something we need when you play in solo, obviously, but even the cost reduction is still pretty nice. Moving on, next we have the upgraded version of Blast Bones, which stays pretty much the same, but the only but pretty significant difference is that now after each of those units take turn, those companions deal 2 damage to each adjacent unit and then is defeated. So this ability essentially becomes like a corpse explosion, because just like before, you deploying all of those companions within your range, then they act in as normal, moving and making engage, but after that they essentially explode and dealing 2 damage to all adjacent units. Now keep in mind, because those companions they deal damage to all the units, it means they potentially can deal damage to each other or your adventurer, again depending on where you're deploying them. Just be mindful about this and maybe try to spread them across. For example, this Spriggan, maybe try to deploy it here if you can, or just make sure that it ends its turn somewhere not adjacent to your companions or your adventurers. This way they engage, then they explode and deal 2 damage to all of those enemies, and they get defeated themselves, which is pretty hilarious I think. It's now almost perfect implementation of corpse explosion from games like Diablo and some other RPGs whenever you see a Necromancer. And finally, moving on to the upgraded version of the Spiritual Guardian, it's also stayed the same overall mechanically, with the only and again very significant difference that it now works on level 5 enemies. And in my opinion, this is where all the fun begins, because now whenever you encounter level 5 enemies, trust me, you want to evaluate them and see, ooh, would this be a good vessel for my Spiritual Guardian? You know, the usual Necromancer things. And personally, I think there are 2 things that are most important to have for your Spiritual Guardian. First of all is dealing damage to multiple targets at once, and also ideally with 3 or more combat dice. So with that in mind, I think this bear might be the best Spiritual Guardian companion, because not only it has unlimited number of targets, it also has 3 combat and also maim and riposte, which are very helpful skills against enemies. Even though of course it has no defense, which means it will take damage quite a lot. Remember that you can buff it up using bone armor and you can heal it a little bit, so it's still possible to keep it alive throughout the whole session, but trust me, the amount of damage and the amount of utility it can deal thanks to maim is just tremendous. Another awesome Spiritual Guardian is this side of this beast is a crocodile, 2 targets, 4 combat dice, super strong. Although frankly I would still prefer bear, even though it has 1 fewer combat. I think maim and riposte are just very helpful. Another Spiritual Guardian I'd recommend is Wood Elf Marauder, 3 combat dice and dodge and 1 defense. This is a very tanky unit, and it can also deal a bunch of damage because of multi-target with 3 combat. Skeleton Mage is also amazing. I think it's the most thematic companion as you can get probably. Also 2 targets and also 3 combat dice, even with range 2 and recover. All of this really helpful. Also there is a Wisp Mother, 3 combat dice, only a single target though, but with a range of 4 that is still pretty helpful. And similar we have Argonian Marauder, also 3 combat dice, just a single target though, but again still pretty helpful. And frankly, these are the only enemies that I would recommend you resurrecting as your Spiritual Guardian, at least from the general enemy pool, with bear probably being the best out of all. So up until you encounter with those enemies, I would recommend you not using your Spiritual Guardian at all, but make sure that you have enough tenacity, maybe sitting at 4 or sometimes even 5 tenacity, just to make sure that whenever you encounter those enemies, you can defeat them and resurrect them right away. Now let's pick a race for our adventurer, and the first one I would recommend is High Elf. I think High Elf is a pretty safe option for pretty much any magic type users, because starting right away with 4 magicka is pretty strong, and the racial ability of healing themselves for 3 health is also pretty helpful, particularly if you're starting with Distraction Staff skill line. So I would say High Elf is a really solid choice, especially if they're beginner friendly and especially in the early game. Breton is the next race I would suggest considering for Necromancer. It's also strong magicka type user, but most importantly the racial ability allows us to overtax a weapon without discarding it. And there are a couple of really strong weapons, some stuffs in particular that we would absolutely happy to have as Breton, though of course the downside is that you never know when you see those items. It can be incredibly strong, and frankly even more stronger than High Elf because of those overtaxing effects in particular, but yeah, just less reliable I would say. Orc is another pretty solid choice. Not a lot of magicka going on here in the beginning, but starting with 3 cooldown is pretty nice as well. But of course the most important part here is the racial ability again, which says once per battle, after the end of your turn, gain 1 hour fatigue to take an immediate extra turn. And the way I see this ability for Necromancer in particular is a sort of like a bad luck protection. Let's say if you rolled all of your key skill dice very poorly, let's say if you rolled a miss on your Expert Summoner, if you rolled a miss of your Power Stone, on Elemental Rage, or maybe some other skill dice that you know that are really important and you would absolutely love to have this on the proper side, but they all landed in a miss. With the Orc's racial ability, you can just take an immediate extra turn, recover all those dice, and hopefully roll them better this time. And finally we have Dark Elf, which starts again with 3 magicka, just like Breton, which definitely helps a lot, though still it's still not as good as having 4 magicka like High Elves does. But their racial ability allows us once per battle during your turn recover any 4 skill dice from your cooldown track, replacing each with a light fatigue. So it's almost essentially almost as good as Orc's racial ability, because let's say if you can roll those dice, you resolve them, you place them in your cooldown track, and then you can recover them and roll them again. Which again, personally, I use this almost like a bad luck protection for some cases when you landed poorly and you rolled a bunch of misses. Although sometimes it can work the other way around. Let's say if you rolled something like Power Stone and you change the result of 1 or 2 dice, then you resolve them, and then you can recover this Power Stone again. I think this racial ability just gives you more control, more backup option if you will, which I think works great on Necromancer, and of course just beyond that, I think Dark Elves just fits the class nicely thematically as well. So as I always say, you can safely pick any race with any class and it's gonna work just fine, but for the purpose of this video I'm gonna choose Dark Elf. Alright, we've got our race, we've got our class, time to build up our adventure. Starting with health, I'm gonna slot this over here on the top left corner, and then for stamina I think I'm gonna slot this across health, and that is simply because I have no intent of leveling up either of those very high. I think maybe having just 3 stamina would do for me, and the rest will still give me enough room to level up some health if I need to. So stamina across health, I think this should be a pretty good choice. For magicka though, I'm definitely gonna level it up all the way to the maximum probably, so we're gonna slot this on a new row, alongside of course for the 3 corresponding stat tokens. And for combat, well, I think I'm gonna slot this across magicka, and even though I just said that I'm gonna level up magicka all the way up to the maximum, I still can afford having 2 combat dice for now, and by the time I would want to train my 5th magicka, I would probably already untrain combat anyway. And I like this particular stat allocation to these slots, simply because it leaves me with 4 open slots to train some other skill lines, which I definitely would want to do that. Now as for the starting skill line, I think it is debatable whether to go for destructive stuff or Daedric summoning, because both of these skill lines are exceptionally good for this particular class and we definitely want them both, but so the question is with which of them do you want to start with. And personally I think destructive stuff is better in this case, simply because level 1 dice from Daedric summoning is not something that we really want, but for destructive stuff on the other hand, those basic 2 force shock dice are really good, especially since we have Boneyard, and this class ability allows us to ignore defense on our target, and therefore even those basic force shock dice, they can deal a lot of damage with the ignoring defense from Boneyard. And of course I'm gonna change the cooldown value to 2, and so that would be the start of our character journey. Now from there, I think as soon as you can, you should train Daedric summoning. And remember that for all secondary skill lines that you train in towns, you don't get automatically any skill dice from that whatsoever, which in this case is actually pretty good, because we don't actually need any of the level 1 skill dice from this skill line. Even though of course we still need to train at least something in order to advance this skill line, so choosing between Daedric Curse and Bound Armaments, I would suggest going for Daedric Curse, even though it's not something we actually need, because as soon as we train that, I would suggest you train in Power Stone, and then even untraining Daedric Curse, and then sliding the Power Stone to the left slot. Just like that. And personally, I'm a huge fan of Power Stone. I think this die is incredibly powerful because it allows us to choose the side if we want, so just even those basic force shock dice can now become a really strong weapon, because we can choose to deal 4 damage if we can afford of course taking true damage, or if we don't want to take true damage we can just safely roll and choose 2 damage instead. So even just having those 3 dice alone makes it already pretty steady and solid damage and quite reliable as well. From there I would go for the level 2 skill die, Destructive Touch. And normally this die is pretty tricky, because on the one side you can instantly defeat a level 1 enemy without any consequences, or on the even best side you can defeat a level 5 enemy with the only downside of having a Bane, which is typically isn't that a big deal, but statistically speaking the most common result that you would get with this die is this one, which is defeating a level 1 or 5 enemy, but for the cost of taking the amount of true damage equal to that enemy's health, which is just something that we cannot afford. But if you combine this with Power Stone, again you can just safely choose the side that you want, so even when you're dealing with a bunch of level 1 enemies, that is still super helpful. Now for your next advancement, if you can, I would recommend training Restoring Light skill line. And of course I completely understand that it's a little bit tricky to recommend training a specific skill lines at a specific time, because you never know what you get in your trainings, but if you can, I think this is great, particularly for this die. And even though this die only heals for 1 health, which might not seems like a big deal, but it can also remove a status die, which is very helpful, especially if we roll Destructive Touch with this particular side, and it's also the only skill die from the restoring skill line that works on our companions, which is exactly what we want. Now from here, hopefully somewhere around this point you will become a master necromancer, and this is where the hunt for a good spiritual guardian should begin. And once you get a found enemy to resurrect as your companion, then it's time to train expert summoner like that. So remember those enemies that roll 3 combat dice for 2 targets? Well, with expert summoner they can roll 6 enemy combat dice against 2 targets, which is just huge. And of course having the number 3 on the expert summoner die is pretty tricky, because it's only one side out of 6, which means only roughly 16% chance of rolling this one. But again, thanks to Power Stone, if we roll these 2 together, then we can hopefully choose this side, which definitely makes it much more reliable. Now somewhere around this point I would suggest investing some experience in your basic stats, a little bit more magicka just to roll more dice in a single engage, a little bit more stamina just to move further, and a little bit more health might also help as well. Somewhere around this stage I would recommend training another skill line, and that is light armor. And of course you never know when you get this skill line. If you happen to see this in a trainer in town, even early game, definitely grab it because you're gonna love it. And we want this skill line because of 2 specific dice. First is Grace, which allows us to combine the value of stamina and magicka when it determines the number of hexes that we can move, which is super helpful because we can essentially just safely ignore our stamina and instead invest more experience in magicka and still have a lot of mobility. And the second die is Spell Warding, which allows us to prevent 1 damage, but what's even more importantly is to recover some dice, which is super relevant and helpful, in particular for Power Stone and Expert Summoner. I think you can also already train Summon, which is another companion from the Daedric Summoning skill line. This particular companion with this side is a ranged companion, and what's even more important, it's aggressive, which means it's gonna reroll all misses, which is very relevant when you're rolling a bunch of dice because of the Expert Summoner. So yeah, this is a great combo, and it also allows us to gain more necrosis to our necrosis stack, which helps a lot. And yeah, of course, cooldown, I would say by this point you should probably aim to have at least 4. That would help a lot, and especially because of our Dark Elf's racial ability, replacing the recovered dice with light fatigue, and so it might be a little bit intimidating to use this at first when you just having 2 cooldown, but once you train it up to 4, I would say you can use this now more freely without worrying too much. Now going back to the Destruction Staff skill line, I think for the level 3 the best option we have is Elemental Rage. Now obviously Pulsar die is very strong as well, but why would we care about dealing only 2 true damage when we can deal potentially up to 7 damage, that also ignoring defense up to 3 potentially. So yeah, this die alone sometimes can even one-shot certain level 10 and even level 20 enemies. And for the same reason, for the final slot of this skill line I prefer to have just a simple another Force Shock die, simply because it can deal so much damage thanks to our Boneyard. And even the way this die looks, it's like kinda, think about it as a bone spears that can go and pierce through the enemies. It's just so thematic, and it's so powerful as well. It honestly feels even better than the level 4 skill die Ancient Knowledge, simply because we can roll this die over and over again, and because it can deal so much damage because of Boneyard. It's just ridiculously strong. And now we're approaching somewhere like the middle or the end of the session 2 XP wise. I think you should aim for up to 5 cooldown at this point. Now also I think you can already safely untrain combat skill dice to train magicka instead, even though it's quite expensive upgrade, but totally worth it. Then you can train another health just to be on a little bit safer side, and for the final skill die we're gonna train this resurrection to have another companion, potentially even low level 5 companion. This one of course is only a temporary companion, it's not like spiritual guardian, it's not gonna persist with us, it's not gonna stay with us from battle to battle, but it's still pretty helpful to have more companions. Now if you happen to have even more experience, you can feel free of course to train more health or even untrain the last combat dice to train a 6 magicka. That would be awesome, though that might be not possible in every campaign. Again, depends on the encounters you're taking or the quests you're going for, or just in general the amount of experience that you might have. And well, that's pretty much is the build. We have a lot of raw damage thanks to having 3 Force Shock dice alongside Elemental Rage, and we can also instantly remove a level 1 or 5 enemies with Destructive Touch, and once you have a good level 5 defeated in the defeated stack, then you can resurrect it and also summon another companion, and also remove Bane status die, and also have a lot of mobility and recovering dice thanks to Spell Warding. So yeah, this is a really strong build. Now let's talk about some items that works well with this build, and the first one is Shoulder Mounted Parasol. It's an accessory that for 1 tenacity interrupt, when you would gain any amount of light fatigue, remove 1 light fatigue from your cooldown track instead. And I think this one is probably the best item that you can have for Dark Elf, regardless of the class, to be honest. So essentially, instead of gaining 4 light fatigue with your racial ability, you can remove 1 instead. And for 1 tenacity mean, this is just huge. If you happen to see this item in the shop, definitely grab it and keep it safe from all the stealing bandits and things like that, particularly if you're playing Dark Elf. Moving on to the next item is the weapon, Restoring Staff. If this engage defeats an enemy, heal for 2 health. I think this staff is universally good for pretty much any character that starts with the Distraction staff, because those basic Force Shock dice, they have 30% chance of dealing 1 true damage to an adventurer, and so if you're playing solo, you are the only adventurer, so you're gonna take some damage here and there, and this stuff certainly helps to kind of mitigate that slightly. Moving on to the next item, that is another weapon, another staff, Old Lightning Staff. After rolling this engage, you may reroll any 1 skill die. You may choose whether to overtax this weapon after rolling. Now, re-rolling the dice is obviously huge, and the fact that it can work on any skill level die also helps a lot, because even though we have Power Stone, it's still just a single die, and sometimes you might miss even on the Power Stone itself, so just having more ability to re-rolling the die, just increasing the likelihood of getting the result that you want, is very powerful. Choosing between the two, I would say that the Restoration Staff is probably more helpful in the early game, whereas Oak Lightning Staff is stronger in the late game. And speaking of rolling and re-rolling, the next item is Silver Circlet. Of course, it's hard not to recommend this item for pretty much any build. For 2 tenacity, interrupt. After rolling, change a single level 1 or level 2 skill die to the side of your choice. And we have a bunch of particular level 2 skill dice that we heavily rely on, that is Expert Summoner, or Destructive Touch, or Power Stone itself. You can spend 2 tenacity to set the side of Power Stone to the number 2, and then you can, with Power Stone, choose the side of 2 other dice, roll the same engage, so it's a little bit of chain reaction going on there, but yeah, it's obviously a very strong item. Moving on next, it's more like a nice to have category. We have Wolf Belt. When you would gain a status die, if you are in magic battle form, you may choose to gain 1 light fatigue instead of the status die. The best part of this item is that it's a passive effect. You don't need to spend tenacity, you don't need to do anything, there are no requirements apart from being in magic battle form, but because we're gonna spend pretty much the majority of our time in magic battle form, it means that this effect would always apply, and because we have Destructive Touch that we're gonna use pretty often, this item helps slightly to offset gaining Bane in particular. Again, not something that we actually need, but sort of nice to have. And more from the nice to have category, we have Sigil of Magnus Gift, which says if your magic stat is even, act as if it's 1 higher. If you are a Breton or High Elf, this item's effect is still active even while it is in your pack. So this item essentially allows us to slightly save experience on advancing magic stat. That's at least the way how I see it. Because you can advance it only up to 4 and still treat this as if you are having 5, so that means that even with 4 magicka, you would still be able to roll 5 dice, let's say. And of course, if you're playing Breton or High Elf, this item is even better because it can work even from your pack. And another one from the nice to have category, we have Strings of Thracian Pearls. It's an accessory for 2 tenacity interrupt. When resolving your recovery step, recover 1 additional die for each legendary item in your ready slots. Now, to be honest, if you happen to have shoulder mounted parasol, you probably don't even need this one, but if you don't have shoulder mounted parasol and if you are playing Dark Elf, then it's very likely that your cooldown track will get pretty cluttered with light fatigue, so this item slightly helps to clear it up between battles. Because let's say if you have this item and maybe this one as well, or pretty much any other legendary, that means you can recover up to 3 dice from your cooldown track during the adventure step. And frankly, since all of our class abilities is not something that we want to use every battle, I find myself pretty constantly sitting with quite a lot of amount of tenacity, so just having extra abilities, extra ways of that you can spend tenacity, I think is pretty nice. Whether it's Silver Circlet, which obviously is super strong, or whether it's this accessory, it's still pretty helpful. Alright, and finally let's see how this class plays and feels in action. For this purpose I created this demo clash scene. As you can probably tell, I also slightly reduced my advancement in order to reduce the amount of experience down to a more realistic level, which is 39 in this case, which means that my enemy pool is also 39, and as you can probably know, that is the most challenging number that you can get. So for the enemy pool of 39, we have a level 20 giant, a huge amount of health, and it targets all adjacent enemies, which is pretty bad for my companions. 3 combat, 2 defense, a pretty scary looking enemy. Then for level 10 we have a Goblin Shaman, also 3 combat dice, and range 4 and recover and rot. And for level 5 we have Skeleton Mage with also 3 combat dice, and divert and recover, and also range 2. And for 4 level 1 enemies we have High Elf Bandit, Orc Bandit, then we have Nord Bandit, as usual plenty of bandits, and Wisp with Decay and Ethereal. As always, I'm starting with no items, no tenacity, and what is even more important for this class specifically, that I'm having no necrosis on my class sheet whatsoever, which definitely makes it more challenging. I do have Spiritual Guardian though, because remember that this unit persists between battles, so for this purpose I've chosen Khajiit Marauder, frankly, simply because it's probably the worst level 5 companion that you can have. It has only 2 combat and it targets only a single enemy. If you've been watching the previous section when I go over the recommended companions, you know that this is probably one of the worst as you can get, but this is exactly why I've chosen this, just to keep my power level down. Alright, so it's the beginning of combat round 1, it's adventurer's turn, and let's see how we can handle this fight. First of all, let's see who is the most threatening enemy. Normally that would be the level 20 enemy, but because this enemy is a range 1, I think I'm safe for now from this enemy. However, Goblin Shaman and Skeleton Mage, they both roll the same number of combat dice as a level 20 enemy, so they are the same power wise, but they also have a range, so even if I'm gonna play defensively and I'm gonna stay on this entrance tile, they can still reach me and probably deal a bunch of damage. This Skeleton Mage though is probably the best unit for Destructive Touch, because remember that Destructive Touch can defeat enemy even regardless of Divert and other similar skills that normally prevent one-shotting enemies. But as you can also probably know, the problem with Destructive Touch that it's very unreliable. In order to get the result that I want, I definitely need to roll it alongside Power Stone, but the same is true for Expert Summoner. I definitely need to put my Expert Summoner up in order to buff up my companions, but rolling all those 3 dice in a single engage might be not the best choice. I also would like to start dealing some damage to start gaining some necrosis stacks, so my class abilities could work, in particular this Boneyard to ignore enemy defense. Alright, so as my first engage, I think I'm gonna roll Destructive Touch alongside Power Stone to hopefully choose the side that I want. I'm also gonna roll 2 Force Shock dice targeting Goblin Shaman because I need to start dealing some damage, and I can still choose one more die roll this engage, and I think I'm probably gonna choose Spell Warding from the Light Armor skill line. I mean, I could definitely choose Elemental Rage to deal some more damage, but I'm probably gonna leave it for another engage, which I'm definitely gonna do later this turn. So okay, these 5 dice targeting Goblin Shaman, and let's see what we get. And oh my goodness, you just look at that, we have Power Stone with number 2, and we even have Destructive Touch with the best side that we already want. You know what, I think this is just too lucky, I think it's too good to be true, so you know what, let me just reroll this again to hopefully get some more kind of average result. And yeah, this is probably more like it. So we have 1 miss on a Force Shock die, we have Power Stone with result number 1, which means we can choose the side of only 1 die instead of 2, and we have Spell Warding with 2 out of 4. So yeah, this is definitely not the best result, but I think it's more kind of more realistic picture. Alright, so first of all, I'm gonna use my Power Stone to change the result of Destructive Touch to this particular side, to instantly defeat a level 5 enemy for the only side of gaining Bane. So I don't mind doing that, and I'm definitely defeating this Skeleton Mage in one go. Yay! So I resolve this die, they go to my cooldown track, and I'm also gaining Bay as part of resolving this side of Destructive Touch. Next I'm resolving Spell Warding, slotting this in my active slot, and I'm also dealing 2 damage to Goblin Shaman, which has 1 defense, which means only 1 damage go through, and I'm gaining this essentially as my necrosis, so I'm putting this on my class sheet. And so I'm resolving this dice as well, and I'm also gaining 1 tenacity because of the miss. Now I'm definitely gonna make another engage, so I'm gaining 2 light fatigue, that is because I'm playing on the expert difficulty. This time I'm gonna try to resurrect this Skeleton Mage as my companion using this skill. I'm probably also gonna roll Summon alongside Elemental Rage to deal some extra damage, and probably Grace and Restoring Light. So yeah, just rolling these 5 dice, and I don't need to declare a target because I don't need to, but if I get this result of Elemental Rage, I'm gonna blow up this cash chip. Alright, so let's see what we get. And wow, look at that. We've got the Resurrect and the Summon on the best side, and even this one. You know what, I think this is again too good to be true, so let me reroll it to see a more like it. It should be a more realistic picture. I think this one is too good, so let me roll it again. And oh my goodness, we still get this Resurrect and the Summon on the best side, and now we got even 7 damage, so I think this is now even better. Oh my goodness, you know what, let me reroll it again. I didn't wanna have such a good result on the video, so yeah, another try. And well, I guess that's more like it, because this is the summon that I don't wanna summon. I would prefer a ranged summon with aggressive, so I'm not even gonna resolve this one. This one is still okay, of course, so I'm definitely gonna resolve this one. This die gets drained, and I am resurrecting Skeleton Mage as my companion, full 5 health, placing this on a hex adjacent to me. And to indicate that this is my companion, I'm gonna put this token on top of it, and I should probably do the same for Gadget Marauder because it's my spiritual guardian. Next, I'm gonna blow up this cash chip using this elemental rage, and I can deal 5 damage to enemies within 2 hexes away from it, which I'm probably gonna use on Giant. So because it has 2 defense, it means only 3 damage goes through, and I'm placing one of those health chips as my necrosis stack. And this cash chip is removed and this die is exhausted. I'm also exhausting this summon because I don't want to summon this one. These 2 dice, they go to my active slots. And I think I'm gonna exhaust this die right away because I don't want to take in true damage. And I think now is the time to use my Dark Elf racial ability to recover 4 skill dice, replacing them with Light Fatigue. And I think I'm gonna recover Power Stone, Summon, as well as 2 Force Shock skill dice. And I'm of course slotting Light Fatigue to the exact same spots where all those dice were. 2 like that and 2 in the middle. Of course, that means that next turn I'm gonna recover essentially only this single die. The rest are all Light Fatigue, but I don't mind because now I can take another engage, so adding 2 more Light Fatigue to my cooldown track, and I'm gonna roll Power Stone, Expert Summoner, and Summon. I could have of course rolled more Force Shock dice alongside it, but that is pretty risky because my cooldown track is full. I mean, in the ideal case, this die will get drained if I summon it, this would go to my active slot, and only this Power Stone will get exhausted, which means technically I still have a room for at least 1 die, but I think I don't want to risk it because some of them can still land on a miss, and I don't want to drain a bunch of these dice and gaining over fatigue and all of this mess. So I think I'm gonna play safely, just rolling these 3 dice, and again I don't need to declare a target, all I frankly need is Expert Summoner. And there we have it, we have this summon, we've got a miss here, but we've got Power Stone, which allows us to change the result of a single die, which frankly is all we need in this case, so I'm gonna change this to Expert Summoner with number 3. Perfect. This goes to my active slot, this goes to my cooldown track, and this gets drained, and I'm summoning another companion. That is Clan Fear that I'm placing on an adjacent hex. And now it's definitely the end of my turn, my cooldown track is full, so now it's my companion's turn. I think I'm gonna start off with Skeleton Mage, and I'm probably gonna target both Giant and Goblin Shaman, because this Skeleton Mage, it can target 2 enemies with a range 2. I'm gonna place this 1-2 hexes like that. And of course, if my Skeleton Mage will defeat Goblin Shaman, that means Orc Bandit will now have a path to deal some damage to me, but frankly I don't mind, and you'll see why in a moment. Alright, so it's engage of my Skeleton Mage targeting Giant and Goblin Shaman with 6 enemy combat dice. That is because it has 3 combat by default plus 3 more with Expert Summoner. So I'm targeting these 2 units with 6 enemy combat dice. This is hilarious. And wow, we've got 2 dice with number 2. I think that is a total of 4, 5, 6, 7 damage, which is above the average. And you know what, let me just reroll it. I think that is again too lucky, and I don't want to spoil it, thinking that I'm too lucky, so let's try it again. And yeah, that is definitely a more realistic picture that you can get normally with enemy combat dice. So we've got 4 damage and 2 misses, definitely more realistic result. So Goblin Shaman takes 3 damage. And of course I'm also placing 1 health chips as my necrosis stack, and Giant also takes 2 damage because it has 2 defense, and my Expert Summoner is now reduced down to 2. I think next I'm gonna activate Clan Fear, and I'm gonna target Orc Bandit, and because Clan Fear has 2 combat dice and I have still 2 charges on my Expert Summoner, it means I'm gonna roll 4 combat dice, which means there's gonna be a pretty good chance of dealing some solid damage. So Clan Fear targeting Orc Bandit with 4 combat dice, the range 3, let's see what we get. And you just look at this roll, this is 6, 7 damage. Wow, this is definitely extremely lucky. So let me re-roll this nonsense. Oh wow. Yeah, that's more like it. 4 damage, I think this is much more realistic picture. So I'm dealing 4 damage to Orc Bandit, and it has 1 defense, means 3 goes through. And of course I'm placing 1 of those health chips to my necrosis stack, so I already have 4 health chips, which is lovely. And of course my Expert Summoner is reduced down to 1. And finally it's Gadget Marauder's turn. I think I'm gonna target Goblin Shaman to finish it off, because I still have 1 charge left in my Expert Summoner. It means I'm gonna roll 3 combat dice, which should be enough to deal 1 damage through 1 defense. So let's see what we get. Gadget Marauder targeting Goblin Shaman. And you just look at that, that is 5 damage. Oh my, what's with my roll today? It's too good to be true, so I'm gonna reroll this again. Yeah, that is more like it. 2 damage, which is still enough to defeat Goblin Shaman, but yeah, that was hilariously lucky to be honest. And of course this health is going to my necrosis stack as well, and my expert summoner is depleted, which is another reason why I wanted to keep at least one slot left in my cooldown track, because otherwise I would need to drain it after dying and gain over fatigue and all those things like that. Alright, now it's enemy's activation turn, starting with the level 20 giant. It moves 1 hex closer to the skeleton mage, because that's the nearest opposing unit, so it's gonna roll 3 enemy combat dice against it. And wow, 1 damage from enemy. I think this is just, again, too unlucky. What with my roll today? You know what, let me re-roll this thing. And yeah, 3 damage, that is more like it. That means the skeleton mage will take 2 damage because it has 1 defense. Next we have Orc Bandit, and it has the same distance to skeleton mage and my adventurer, as well as this clan fear companion, but because its priority is targeting strongest enemy, which means it's going closer to my adventurer. And so it's gonna roll 2 enemy combat dice targeting both my adventurer as well as my summon companion. And that is 2 damage, which means my companion takes 1 damage because it has 1 defense. And as for my adventurer, I'm gonna use my spell warden, and remember that I can change this die down to any number, and in the process I can recover dice of that level. So I'm reducing this from 2 down to 0, which allows me to recover a level 2 skill die, which is expert summoner in this case, and this gets exhausted like that. And I'm also preventing 1 damage, which means I'm only taking 1 damage, which I don't mind. Next we have the Snort Bandit's turn, and it's just roll 1 enemy combat dice targeting both my skeleton mage and clan fear. That is 1 damage, which both of these units prevent the damage, so they take no damage. Next is Wisp, they're gonna target my skeleton mage as well with 2 enemy combat dice. That is 2 damage, and my skeleton mage takes 1 because of 1 defense, and because a Wisp is ethereal and decay, it also takes in 1 damage itself as well. And finally, it's High Elf Bandit, which has, I think, enough range to my skeleton mage as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, yep, that's the valid target, so it's gonna roll 1 enemy combat dice, targeting skeleton mage. And that is another damage, which skeleton mage prevents thanks to its defense. And that was the end of enemy's activation turn. Now it's the beginning of combat round 2, adventurer's turn again. I'm gonna recover 5 dice, which in this case is most of them is just light fatigue, so I'm moving 4 light fatigue to the supply, and recovering destructive touch, and sliding the remaining dice to the left. And now let's see how many necrosis stack I have on my class sheet. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which means I'm ignoring 2 defense on my target, which means I can already treat this giant as having essentially no defense, which is lovely. And so I'm gonna roll all 3 of my Force Shock dice alongside Expert Summoner, targeting giant, and let's see what we get. Alright, and this is not too bad, because that is 6 damage, which we essentially can treat almost as true damage in this particular case, because we have 5 stacks in our necrosis stack, which means Boneyard ignores 2 defense, which means those 6 damage would be already enough to defeat this giant, which is lovely. And we're also gaining the last 6 chip to our necrosis stack, and this enemy is defeated, and because it's defeated, its Chillblade skill doesn't even trigger essentially. So we're not even gaining extra light fatigue. So Expert Summoner goes to the active slot, and we're resolving this one, moving to the cooldown track, like so. Now we finally have 6 health chips in our necrosis stack, but unfortunately I don't have enough tenacity to activate the blast bones, which honestly completely unnecessary at this point, but I think this would be hilarious. But hey, you know what, I think I'm just gonna use at least bone armor, because why wasting these health chips anyway. So I'm spending 1 tenacity and removing 2 health chips from here, and I could move them under any unit. And because I took 1 damage this combat, I think I'm gonna put this under my character to essentially heal myself in a way. Of course the extra health will go away at the end of battle, but at least I'm gonna be still at full health. And I think I'm just gonna move 2 hexes away from those enemies, and I'm gonna let my companions do the rest of the work. So it's my companion's turn, and again starting with skeleton mage, I'm gonna move them 1, 2, 3 hexes away, and that is possibly because I have expert summoner, so I have +2 extra movement, and I'm gonna target those both High Elf Bandit and Wisp with 5 enemy combat dice. And we've got 4 damage and 1 miss, which is already enough to defeat Wisp, so Wisp is defeated and I'm gaining 1 chip to my necrosis stack. The High Elf Bandit, it prevents 1 damage because it has dodge, which means only 3 damage go through, but that is still enough to defeat this enemy, so High Elf Bandit is defeated as well. And of course my expert summoner is reduced down to 1. Next I'm gonna activate Clan Fear, I'm gonna roll 3 enemy combat dice targeting Nord Bandit. Wow, we've got 2 misses, but because this unit is aggressive, I can reroll those 2 misses, hopefully with something better. and we still got a miss, but at least that's 2 damage in total. And of course I'm gaining 1 of those health chips to my necrosis stack as well, so it's back to full 6, which is lovely. And my expert summoner is exhausted down to 0. And now it's my Gadget Marauder's turn. They're gonna roll 2 enemy combat dice targeting Orc Bandit. And we've got 2 damage, which is enough to defeat this Orc Bandit as well, which was sitting at the last health chip. Alright, now it's enemy's turn. The final poor Node Bandit just rolling a single enemy combat dice targeting my Clansphere companion. That is even no damage. Wow, I feel bad for this guy. Now it's the beginning of combat round 3. I'm recovering 5 dice, so I'm moving 3 of this light fatigue to the supply. Recovering these 2 dice, the Restoring Light and Elemental Rage, and I suppose this one should be here. And now, well, frankly, I don't even need to do anything in particular. I can just move around, maybe loot some cash chip, and even though it's pretty far away, remember that I have Grace, which means I can add Magicka to my stamina in order to move. So you know what, let me just show you how it works. I'm gonna reduce this down to 1, and now I essentially have 8 movement. Because 3 stamina plus 5 Magicka, so that means I can now move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is perfectly enough to reach this cash chip. And let's just pretend that I'm making a lockpick check. I don't care about the item obviously in the demo example, and you know what, I think I'm just gonna leave my turn like that. I don't want to make any engage, I'll just let my summons do their job. Starting with the Skeleton Mage, I'm gonna move 1, 2 hexes closer to Node Bandit. I'm gonna roll 3 enemy combat dice. Let's see what we get. We got 2 damage. Don't even need to put anything in my necrosis attack because it's already full with 6 health. And I think I just realized that because this enemy has recovered, I should have recovered last turn and this turn. So even though it doesn't matter, you know, just for the sake of making sure that we're playing correctly, I'm gonna add these 2 health chips for this turn and for the previous turn. Again, this doesn't change anything really, but again, why not? Next is Clansphere's turn. Gonna roll 2 enemy combat dice, and we've got 3 damage, which is the end of this combat. Of course, you know what, if I wanted, I could have just let this enemy sit around and hitting my enemies, and I could have recovered all of those dice again, but I think that is a little bit lame way of playing. Honestly, I don't abuse this, even though I could surely just spend 2 extra turns on this class just to recover all of my dice. But yeah, I think that is pretty much it. And again, it's a little bit shame that I didn't have a chance to use Blast Bones. This definitely is a pretty fun skill, summoning a horde of enemies, but that was simply not even needed on this particular clash. And because I ended this battle with 6 chips in the necrosis stack, which means in the next combat I could potentially use my Force Shock die, ignoring up to 3 defense on the enemy, which is just huge. And of course I could potentially let this Gadget Marauder get killed to resurrect some better enemies as my spiritual companion, and of course I could use some bone armor to buff up that companion. So yeah, Necromancer is a very fun class to play. I love it. It's so thematic and it's so strong as well, particularly because of the Boneyard. You really should not underestimate the effect of this ignoring defense. It's really that strong, because that means that potentially even this side of Force Shock, which normally deals only 2 damage, can essentially treat this as a dealing 5 damage if you're targeting this for the enemy that has 3 defense. So yeah, Necromancer is really strong. I love how it's paired, especially with Dark Elf, that you can recover some extra dice, especially Power Stone or Expert Summoner. And even though we're gaining a bunch of light fatigue instead, I think for this particular class it's the least a problem, because I have so many summons that can do all the dirty work, so we can just walk around safely, which is yeah, super strong and a lot of fun. And that's a wrap for today's video. This class, guys, take quite a bit of time and effort to put together, so if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe for more board gaming content. And if you would like to support the channel directly, you can also do this over on Patreon, and it really means a lot to me. And well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.